Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining our Women with Heart online session this morning. The presentation today is going to be all about wearables. So I am actually the one who's going to do the presentation today. My name is Dr. Lisa Cotie, and I am a postdoctoral researcher here at the Toronto Rehab Institute. I started here back in February of this year. I came from the University of Ottawa Heart Institute, where I did research for 4 years before coming here. My area of focus for my research is women's heart health, and specifically how physical activity fits into women's heart health. So my presentation today is called The New Kids on the Block. Let's talk about wearables. So what are we going to discuss today? So I'm going to do a quick overview of the common technologies that are behind accelerometers, heart rate monitors, pedometers, and GPS wearables. Then we're going to talk about what information we can actually get from wearables. I'm going to talk about a few different research studies that talk about the accuracy of wearables. And then how can these wearables help us with our cardiac rehab programs? And finally, I'll go through some of the pros and cons of owning a wearable. So what is a wearable? Wearables are electronic technologies or computers that are incorporated into items of clothing and or accessories which can be worn on the body. They have communication capabilities and allow the wearer to access information in real time. It's likely that many of you listening today own some type of wearable. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of different possibilities on the market. And of course, this means there are many, many different combinations of features available. I'm going to begin by talking about some of the technologies behind the common types of wearables. Let's start with the technology associated with accelerometers. Accelerometers are devices that measure body movements in terms of acceleration. This in turn can then be used to estimate the intensity of physical activity over time. The majority of accelerometers in use today are piezoelectric sensors. So what that means is that electricity is generated in response to mechanical stress or pressure. So to help better understand this, I'm just going to give a really quick physics lesson or reminder. So speed is the change in position with respect to time. We all know about speed, kilometers per hour, meters per second, etc. Acceleration is the change in speed with respect to time. So when acceleration is 0, the body of interest is no longer changing its speed, though it may still be moving if the body has a constant speed associated with it. So as long as there's no change in speed, then the acceleration is 0. So acceleration is an increase in speed over time, and deceleration is a decrease in speed over time. So how the piezoelectric technology works is that the majority of accelerometers contain a sensor that detects acceleration, which causes this piezoelectric element of the device to deform in the form of bending. The bending causes a displaced charge to build up, and this creates a voltage signal, which is proportional to the applied acceleration, thus providing us with acceleration data. The majority of accelerometers on the market today detect acceleration in 1 to 3 planes. So we have uniaxial, biaxial, and triaxial. So uniaxial measures acceleration about the x-axis or the longitudinal axis. Biaxial accelerometers measure acceleration about the x, so the longitudinal, and the y, the frontal axes. And then there's triaxial, which is the most common type of accelerometer on the market today. And this measures acceleration about the x, y, and Z axes. Okay, so what about heart rate monitors? There are two types of heart rate monitors. We have our chest worn and our wrist worn. A chest worn heart rate monitor consists of two parts. We have a transmitter, which is attached to a belt that's worn around the chest, and then a receiver worn on the wrist like a watch. And you can see that in the top graphic here, where she has on the chest strap and then the wrist worn receiver. As the heart beats, an electrical signal is transmitted through the heart, signaling the heart to contract. This electrical activity can be detected through the skin. The transmitter part of the heart rate monitor is placed on the skin around the area that the heart is beating, and it picks up that electrical signal. The transmitter then sends an electromagnetic signal containing the heart rate data to the wrist receiver, which then displays your heart rate. Alternatively, the wrist-worn monitor uses what's called photoplethysmography to measure heart rate. And so what that means is that the monitor shines a low intensity infrared light into the skin. And what it does is measure the amount of light that is scattered by blood flow. So when light travels through biological tissues, it's absorbed by bone, skin, venous blood, arterial blood. So since light is more strongly absorbed by blood than any of those other surrounding tissues, the change in blood flow can be detected by this photoplethysmography sensor. So as these, what happens is it senses a change in the intensity of that light that it's shining through. The voltage signal from the photoplethysmography is proportional to the quantity of blood flowing through the blood vessels, which reflects the pulse rate, hence giving us our heart rate value through the wristwatch. Okay, so next we have pedometers. So a pedometer contains a horizontal spring-suspended lever that moves up and down with each step that you take. Movement of the lever opens and closes an electrical circuit, and then the accumulated step count is shown on the display. So you can enter in a variety, depending on the pedometer, you can enter in a variety of personal information, you know, height, weight, age, sex. The other thing you can enter in is your typical stride length. And so with that information, some pedometers are able to estimate the distance that you've traveled by taking the number of steps that it has recorded and multiplying it by your entered stride length. What pedometers typically can't do, though, is predict your intensity level. They can give you the number of steps, but not generally how intense the physical activity you're doing is. Legend has it, at least in the United States, that Thomas Jefferson invented the first pedometer. However, historical evidence cannot be denied, and Leonardo da Vinci is generally regarded as first coming up with the concept of the pedometer. Some of his drawings and sketches illustrate a gear-driving device with a pendulum arm that would swing back and forth with every leg motion while walking. In other words, a mechanical pedometer. So apparently he wanted to measure distances more accurately so he could make precise maps. Okay, and finally, we have GPS, or Global Positioning System. So GPS is one of the many global navigation satellite systems in the world. GPS is owned by the United States government. The program was started by the US Department of Defense in the 70s. It was originally limited to use by the US military until civilian use was allowed in the 80s. Since that time, other countries have developed their own global navigation satellite systems. For example, Russia has GLONASS, Japan has Quasi-Zenith or QZSS, The European Union has Galileo, and China, India, and other countries also have their own global navigation satellite systems. So you can pair these with GPS or use them on their own. When paired together, they of course enhance the capabilities of the GPS system. So how does it work? GPS satellites circle the Earth in a very precise orbit, and they transmit signal information to Earth. GPS receivers triangulate these signals received from the satellites to calculate position and track movement. GPS can provide geolocation and time information to a GPS receiver anywhere on or near the Earth, where there is an unobstructed line of sight to 4 or more GPS satellites. Obstacles such as mountains and buildings can actually block this signal. So you need to make sure that you have an unobstructed pathway. GPS does not require the user to transmit any mobile data and operates independent of any telephone or internet reception. However, these technologies can enhance the GPS signal. So this next slide, I have just listed some of the common commercially available wearable brands. So Fitbit, you can see here, many of you I'm sure have heard of Fitbits, are common accelerometers, and they are triaxial accelerometers. Piezo is a very common pedometer, and it can provide us with step data. It estimates your moderate to vigorous minutes per week of physical activity, and it can measure how many bouts of physical activity you do. Polar is a very common heart rate monitor company, and we have wrist and chest monitors associated with Polar. And finally, Garmin is probably our most common or most well-known GPS-related company. So what do wearables offer in terms of information or data? So there are many, many different outputs that you can receive. And of course, with all of the different wearables, there are many different combinations of what wearables have and don't have, etc. So some of the common things are steps, your intensity minutes or your minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity in a week, heart rate, and of course they can do resting heart rate or your heart rate during activity, distance, and this would require GPS technology. Some of them can provide sleep data, and this is not just the quantity of sleep, but also the quality of sleep. And this is typically measured based on your movement throughout the night, as well as your heart rate patterns throughout the night. Many of the monitors can estimate your calories burned, floors, so as in the number of flights of stairs that you go up or down during the day, and stress level. So stress is typically measured using heart rate variability with these measures, or sorry, with these wearables. Some other wearables can also provide you information about estimated VO2 max, your fitness age, and many, many other pieces of data and information. So what is the most accurate wearable? Well, it all comes down to what you want out of your wearable. There's no one answer to which one is the best. The research associated with wearables for prescribing and monitoring physical activity is a growing area of research. We have studies that are looking at the validity of them. And so what I mean by this is, does it actually measure what we want it to? So we compare it to what's called the gold standard measure of whatever it is you're interested in, and see if it's actually measuring the same as that other measure. We have reliability studies. So is it consistent across time? Does it give you the same value each time that you're doing something? We have experimental studies that are examining effectiveness of wearables in improving physical activity levels, and observational studies examining the effectiveness of wearables in maintaining physical activity. So I'm going to present to you 4 different research studies Now, keeping in mind there are thousands of research studies out there, and I've just chosen these 4 to show you some of the accuracy of the different technologies with some of the different wearables out there. So the first study I'm going to show you here is looking at the accuracy of heart rate monitors. And so what they did is they had participants wear 5 different types of heart rate monitors, and they compared them to ECG. They had them wearing these during rest as well as during exercise. Some of the monitors were wrist worn and some of them were chest strap monitors. So the accuracy of chest strap electrode-based heart rate monitors has been confirmed. We know that these are fairly accurate. However, the accuracy of wrist-worn optical-based heart rate monitors is very uncertain. This particular study concluded that there was variable accuracy among wrist-worn heart rate monitors. None achieved the accuracy of a chest strap-based monitor. The accuracy of the wrist-worn monitors were best at rest and actually diminished with exercise. So typically we say if you're just walking or doing physical activity that has your heart rate falling below 100 beats per minute, that a wrist-worn heart rate monitor would be pretty appropriate for that. As you start to do more physical activity and your heart rate raises above 100 beats per minute, the more accurate wearable to use would be a chest strap, and that's where we get our most accurate heart rate values. Electrode-containing chest monitors should be used when accurate heart rate measurements are imperative. So because as cardiac patients, you would increasingly rely on these monitors to stay within physician-recommended safe heart rate thresholds during your rehab or other types of exercise, it would be really appropriate to wear these chest straps, and it really highlights the need for appropriate validation of these devices in cardiac patients, as accuracy is quite important here. So the next study I have here looked at the accuracy of 8 different devices in terms of energy expenditure or calories burned. So it was conducted in 60 healthy men and women. Participants were fitted with the gold standard, which was the Oxyconn Mobile. And this is the gold standard for measuring metabolic analysis or calories burned. And what they did is paired that with 8 different types of activity monitors. So each participant had all of the 8 monitors on at one time, as well as the Oxyconn Mobile. They had everyone do activities that fit into the categories of sedentary, walking, running, and moderate to vigorous activities such as stairs, biking, elliptical. So what you'll see is along the y-axis or the vertical axis there is the percentage error that they found in each of the 8 devices. So of the 8 monitors tested, the body media fit had the highest correlation with the gold standard Oxyconn Mobile. And so it had less than 10% error. But what the authors concluded in this research study was that the results collectively demonstrated that there's good potential for almost all of the models, with the exception of the basis band, which had almost 25% error. But the remainder of the devices really had less than 15% error. And so it showed that really most of these are quite appropriate in terms of accuracy for energy expenditure. So this is a study that looked at the accuracy of different wearables at measuring step counts. So they had 35 healthy adults wear 10 different trackers at the same time for both treadmill and over ground walking. So what they compared was the step counts from the actual wearable to manually counted steps. So they videotaped the walking, and they after the fact, they counted the steps manually that the person took. So what you'll see here is that the dotted lines represent 5% error, and the dark black lines represent 10% error. So you can see the top three had less or had 5% or less error. And then as you go down, you start to see some of them spreading out into that 10%. And then finally, the polar loop and the Nike fuel band falling outside of that 10% error. And so essentially they concluded that the majority of the monitors had improved accuracy as the speeds got faster on the treadmill. So the slower you walked, the more inaccurate the step counts were. The Fitbit Zip, the one at the very top, showed that it was actually accurate both at fast and low speeds, but also both on the treadmill and on the ground. Okay, and so the final study I will discuss looked at the accuracy of measuring intensity minutes, or your minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity throughout the week. And so this study tested 22 active women. The women were outfitted with a Fitbit that was worn on the waist, a Fitbit that was worn on the bra, and a Fitbit on the wrist. And then also an actigraph, which was used as the gold standard, and that was worn on the waist. They wore them for 7 days. They concluded that all Fitbit activity monitors overestimated the moderate to vigorous physical activity minutes per week and underestimated sedentary time compared to the gold standard actigraph. So one positive about this study is that it's one of few studies that actually looked at free living conditions. So it wasn't conducted in a lab, it wasn't on a treadmill. You know, they took the monitors home and they wore them for 7 days in their sort of home environment in free living conditions. So the other important part here was that regardless of where you wore the Fitbit, so whether it was on your waist, on the bra, or on the wrist, they all provided similar activity monitoring values, and essentially tells us that users can wear the devices wherever best accommodates their lifestyle or needs, that the location of the wear did not seem to matter in terms of these Fitbits. So my take-home message here on all of the research I've shown you with respect to accuracy is that you need to decide what you want from your wearable. Is it important to you to have accurate heart rate data, or accurate number of steps, calories burned, minutes per week of moderate to vigorous physical activity? You have to decide what you want from your wearable, and then you need to do your research. You need to make sure that you know what wearables have what outputs and how accurate they may be. Remember that none of these wearables are perfect, and so you always have to take the data that you're getting with a grain of salt. So how can we use wearables for exercise prescriptions? So what I've put here are the cardiac rehab guidelines as well as the Canadian physical activity guidelines. And typically as exercise researchers or exercise physiologists, we look at exercise prescription using what's called the FIT principle. And so you can see along the left side here, we've got FIT. So F is for frequency of the physical activity, I is for the intensity of your activity, time is how long you might do a bout of exercise, and type is the mode or the type of activity that you might do. And so do wearables provide us with the information to actually track all of this information and help us to stay within our cardiac rehab or the Canadian physical activity guidelines? Most of the wearables do provide us with the option of tracking the frequency of our activity. And so here I've got an example of Fitbit data or Fitbit output on the left and polar heart rate output on the right. And so you can see built right into the programs with these wearables come a calendar which shows you how many days per week you did your physical activity. And the polar one, it's probably not the easiest to see here, but even provides you with data on the amount of time you took doing the activity on those specific days and even the intensity level. So we can certainly track our frequency using a variety of different wearables. How about intensity? Well, of course. So most of our wearables track intensity or collect data on intensity by comparing your heart rate during the activity to your average resting heart rate. So it would be important for you to wear your wearable during rest as well as during your activity in order to get accurate intensity data. So some people would prefer to just put it on when they're about to start their activity, but to get the most accurate intensity data, it would be important to have it track some of your resting heart rate as well. Some wearables use heart rate zones, and so you can manually enter in specific zones that you want your heart rate to be in, and they will track whether you've reached that zone, if you're above it or below it, and how long you've been in those zones. Some of our wearables estimate the metabolic equivalence, and as soon as you're over 3 METs or metabolic equivalents, it starts to count as moderate to vigorous physical activity. And finally, some wearables count your intensity based on your steps per minute. And so the thought is, once you reach an intensity of greater than 100 steps per minute, you're thought to have entered into that moderate to vigorous physical activity zone. And so point here is that our wearable certainly can track our intensity. How about time? And so I've just shown you some examples here. We have some Garmin watches and a Polar watch, but most of the wearables do provide you with the ability to track the amount of time that you're doing the activity for. And so they have some form of stopwatch available within the wearable. You can even see in the picture at the top there, the one in the middle, that you can even track your laps if you happen to be doing laps of a track or something like that. You can measure the amount of time it took you for each lap. So many of our wearables here give you the option of choosing which type of activity you're going to do before you start recording. And really all this does is it starts different features of the wearable based on the activity that you're going to do. So if you were going to be doing resistance training, for instance, some of our wearables can actually count the repetitions. And so it turns on the feature within the wearable that would allow us to do that. The heart rate function for running versus walking would be different. If you're going swimming, usually the heart rate function doesn't work on a typical wearable. So if you typed in that you were swimming in it, then it would not start that function. And so essentially it does allow you to track which type of activity you're going to do, and it sets the appropriate functions to work. Okay. And finally, I'm going to talk about pros and cons of using wearables. I'm going to start with the cons because I like to finish on a positive note, so I'll finish with the pros. So some of the cons that are possible with using wearables would be some people become obsessed with the data that it provides us. And this can actually lead to stress and anxiety, and it can distract you from the real point of it, which is to just be physically active and to get out there and do some form of exercise. And it's really important to, use this data, but not to become obsessed with it, and making sure that we're just using it as a guideline. Some of our wearables can be quite expensive. And when I created this slide, I actually looked up the cheapest and the most expensive wearables that are out there on the market. So the cheapest one I found was this very simple pedometer that's available at Walmart, and it was $9.98. All it does is provide you with your number of steps. That's it, very simple. The most expensive one blew my mind. It was from Tag Heuer, which is a Swiss company, and it was $180,000, and it provided a whole host of different wearable technologies, but of course it was covered in diamonds, which I'm sure is what drove the price up. But typically, so the point being, you can get wearables in a whole range of prices. Typically, if you wanted ones that have your heart rate and your calories and your steps and all this type of stuff, and GPS, you're looking to spend probably somewhere between $125 to about $400, depending on which device you look at. Battery life has been an issue, and typically battery life depends on the features that you're using. If you're using GPS to track your routes every time you go out for a walk, that drains the battery, and you may have to charge your wearable every single day. Data accuracy, and we went over that when we looked at the research. There's a whole range of accuracy, and it all just depends on what you're looking for in your wearable. And then, of course, privacy and security. So, you are having your data out there, it's being transmitted to your computer or your phone or whatever. And there is the possibility that some of these companies are collecting some of this data. Of course, it would be anonymous, but they are collecting some of this data for their own accuracy studies. So keeping that in mind. So what are some of the pros for using a wearable? Wearables can be great motivators. One example would be, I remember, there were times when my husband and I it would be 8 o'clock at night, and we'd look at our wearables and say, oh, we've got 8,000 steps. Let's go for a walk to get it up to 10,000 steps. And so we'd go, for a walk in the evening. And so it's a really great motivator to get you to start doing some physical activity. They're quite convenient and portable. You can wear them on your wrist, and you don't need to be near a computer or a phone to actually use the device. It gives you personalized data. And so it's the data that's being collected from you. And so it's nobody else's data but your own. You can enter in your height, your weight, your age, your sex, all this stuff to make it even more personalized to you. It can assist with treatment plans. So like I talked about, the different features which correspond with our cardiac rehab programs or other types of exercise programs. And as we talked about, they're becoming more and more accurate. The research is ongoing and it's becoming better. These companies are starting to improve the technology, and so they are becoming more and more accurate. So my final slide here is that, of course, there are many options, many features, and so you need to decide what you want out of your wearable. Do your research, and you find the wearable that suits you the best. So thank you very much for tuning in, and I am more than happy to take questions if anybody has any. Okay, so it looks like we have a couple of questions. Okay, so I see one here that says, my Fitbit doesn't reflect a change in heart rate when I use a recumbent bike. Why would that be? So there's a number of possibilities. If you're using a heart rate monitor that is wrist worn, it's really, really important that the device is right at your wrist, that it's snug, not tight that it's uncomfortable, but that it's fit snugly on your wrist so that, I talked about the fact that how that technology works is that it's shining a light through your skin, and then it needs to detect the change in intensity of that light. So it needs to have a good contact with your skin in order to be able to do that. If you are using a chest-worn strap, it could be, again, that the contact with your skin is not great. If you're using a chest-worn strap, we typically say that you should dampen the electrodes. So you should run it under water to make sure that you get a really good connection to the skin. The other thing is it depends on what recumbent bike you're using. Sometimes some of our pieces of equipment actually have a built-in heart rate monitor, and so it is possible that your heart rate's being reflected on the actual recumbent bike itself, that the signals are maybe getting crossed, and so that would be another thing that you could look into, is whether the actual recumbent bike itself has the built-in polar technology built right into it, and if you need to turn that off, or if you just look at the recumbent and it might be reflecting your change in heart rate. The other thing is you should see an increase in heart rate as you get going with the exercise. But if you hit sort of a steady state where the intensity isn't getting any higher with your exercise, you may find that your heart rate stays fairly stable when you're doing that physical activity. What is continuous heartbeat monitoring that many fitness bands employ? How accurate they really are. I'm using Fitbit Charge 3. And so again, similar answer would be depending on if you're using a wrist-worn one or a chest-worn heart rate monitor. It would be giving you sort of a continuous heart rate. If you're using a chest-worn monitor, it actually samples a little more regularly than the wrist-worn one, hence why it can also be a bit more accurate, is because it's giving us information a little more often than the wrist-worn monitors are. And so we are getting a little more continuous heart rate as opposed to random sampling of the heart rate. The Fitbit Charge 3, I don't know if I know exactly how accurate that one is, but it would be worth you looking up on the Fitbit website, or specifically on your Fitbit Charge 3, to see how accurate it is. If I go back to my slide here, sorry, just give me a second, about the accuracy of heart rate monitors, you can see that the Fitbit Charge HR, which is not exactly what you were talking about, but it's a similar one, had sort of moderate accuracy. So 0.84, we're trying to get as close to 1 as we can with this type of statistical analysis. So 0.84 is certainly not bad. It isn't the best. You can see that the Polar H7 was almost right at 1, so it was the most accurate. But a 0.84 is sort of moderate accuracy, moderate to high accuracy. And so you can be fairly confident with the values that you're getting with your Fitbit. But like I said, none of them are perfect. So taking every piece of data that you get with your wearables with a grain of salt. So thank you very much for joining us today for my talk on wearables. Please join us next Tuesday at 10 a.m. Our dietitians, Veronica, Fatim, and Samantha, will be talking about nutrition for women over 50. And so if you're interested in information about that, I definitely suggest that you tune in next Tuesday, July 21st at 10 a.m. And as always, today's session and all of our sessions are available on the Cardiac College website if you scroll through to the Women with Heart online. So thank you very much for joining today, and we'll see you next week.